start the recording?
Yeah, it's not.
Okay. Well, it is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jessica Lovering, the Executive Director of the Good Energy Collective. Jessica is co-founder and Executive Director of the Good Energy Collective, a new organization working on progressive nuclear policy. She completed her PhD in Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Her dissertation focused on how commercial nuclear trade affects international security standards and how very small nuclear reactors could be deployed at the community level. She is a fellow with the Energy for Growth Hub, looking at how advanced nuclear reactors can be deployed in sub-Saharan Africa. She was formerly the director of the energy program at the Breakthrough Institute, a pioneering research institute changing how people think about energy and the environment. Her work at Breakthrough sought policies to spur innovation in nuclear power technologies to drive down costs and accelerate deployment as part of a solution to climate change and economic development. She has a bachelor's degree in astrophysics from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's degree in energy policy from the University of Colorado. I have had the pleasure of seeing Dr. Lovering speak in person before. I'm glad that she has agreed to join us today. So with that, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk with everyone today. So can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to start sharing my screen.
Okay. You won't be able to see the chat, so we'll monitor the chat window for questions for you.
Okay, great. And see. Okay, so I look full screen for everyone?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks for that introduction. Today, I am going to be giving a pretty broad overview talk of what does the future of nuclear energy look like. I'm going to be covering a lot of different topics, but I did leave time for questions as I'm assuming there will be some good questions. So keep that in mind as we go. So Jeff already gave an introduction of me, so I will skip this over, but I've been working in nuclear policy for about 10 years now. So all aspects of it, and I did recently finish my PhD 2 years ago, and I'm going to be weaving in a lot of my research and my results into this talk as well. So there's a lot more detail I could go into it if people have specific questions. And I've tried to include sources on all the slides whenever I'm referring to studies by myself or other people, so you can follow up if you're interested. And Jeff did give a quick introduction to Good Energy Collective. We are a progressive think tank that works on nuclear energy specifically. And that is kind of a question right off the bat of why are we focused on nuclear energy? And specifically, if we're, left-leaning folks, progressives who care about climate change, nuclear doesn't seem like the obvious choice to a lot of folks. So why are we focused on nuclear energy when there were all these other options like renewables and, battery technology? Why are we focused on nuclear? And why do we care about it? So I will say, as a caveat, we care about all sorts of clean energy. The goal really for us is, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing air and water pollution and improving the environment and improving public health outcomes. So, we're open to everything. And part of the reason that we're focused on nuclear specifically is that it has some unique benefits. It also has a lot of unique challenges. And so we're working on addressing those challenges through development of smart policy. So I did want to start with a little bit of why nuclear for those who aren't as following nuclear, or maybe who are following nuclear and don't really like it. So a little bit about that. So the obvious thing for start is that nuclear is low carbon. It has zero emissions when it's operating, and even over its life cycle, including mining and construction, it has very low emissions, on par with wind and solar. It's also large scale. In many countries, nuclear is the largest source of low carbon electricity. That's true in the US. In some places, nuclear provides most of the country's electricity, like in France, or in Sweden, it's 40%. So that's kind of the reason there's still ongoing interest in nuclear. Nuclear was a really big part of how countries secured energy independence in the 70s, particularly getting off oil for electricity generation. But moving into modern times, we have cheaper options. And so why are we still talking about nuclear? So first of all, yes, renewables like wind and solar are getting very cheap, and they're scaling up very fast. And that's great. No arguments with that. But it is hard to power a whole grid with just wind and solar, with just renewables. You need a mix of different types of generating technology. And I grabbed this graphic from Jesse Jenkins, who's an academic that's now at Princeton, but he has written in the past about kind of different categories of electricity generating technologies and groups them into these three buckets. And so this bottom one here, firm low carbon resources. That's really where nuclear shines. Nuclear is our best option for firm low carbon power. And firm power is something that kind of maintains reliability on the grid and can balance out in the longer time periods the intermittency of wind and solar, and even hydro, which is seasonally intermittent and constrained. And there's been lots of studies. I'm not going to go into all of them right now. I did link to one that's recent. The Environment Organization Environmental Defense Fund did some modeling work on California, which has this aggressive decarbonization target. And they found that California really needs clean, firm power to meet these aggressive decarbonization goals. And really any country does, or any region that's looking to dramatically reduce their emissions. Because you can't sort of run a grid 24/7 if you don't have that firm power. And if you're going for zero carbon, you really need a low carbon firm option, and there just aren't that many available. Here we go. Okay, so you can see this playing out in real time. There's lots of examples in the US that I could give. We've seen when nuclear power plants close, they're often replaced by natural gas because that's what's cheap in the US right now. And also it's really enabled the growth of renewables. So while renewables are cheap in the US, and we built a lot, you need something to back them up. And in the US, natural gas has filled that role. So we see that in the US, and we've also seen this in Europe. Places that have high penetrations of renewables, places like Germany, Denmark, also have some sort of cheap fossil fuel available to be that backup power. And more in Europe, at least, that's become natural gas, as countries in the 70s were trying to get off oil and are now trying to get off coal. They moved to natural gas. And while that can be okay from a grid reliability perspective, it's great. From a carbon perspective, if you're moving from oil or coal to natural gas, that's also not terrible. It does reduce emissions, but if you're looking to get to zero carbon, natural gas is not great. And there's starting to be some perhaps obvious constraints on natural gas, particularly for Europe, where a lot of their natural gas comes from Russia. And as they're considering possible sanctions on Russian energy imports, or even just constraints due to the war in Ukraine, This really brought it to the forefront that in the push to get off nuclear in parts of Europe, it's really pushed countries onto more dependence on Russian gas, which had made them particularly vulnerable to disruptions from this conflict. And we've actually seen in the last few weeks, countries like Belgium and Germany, which had planned nuclear phase outs, starting to reconsider those and maybe put them on pause in light of the war in Ukraine, because they don't want to be importing more gas when they close those nuclear power plants or have even higher gas prices in the future. Okay, and the last one I want to talk about, which even people who are very focused on climate don't necessarily think about a lot, which is land use. If you're more of a traditional environmentalist, you might think about land use and land use change, but maybe not in the context of energy so much. And the reason for that is probably that right now, the energy system we have is pretty land efficient. Fossil fuels are very dense energy. And for all their faults in terms of emissions and harming ecosystems through extraction, they are pretty dense and the power plants are pretty small. So going forward, looking at low carbon options, renewables like wind and solar are pretty land extensive, meaning they use a lot of land to generate electricity. So I have this example that I like to give from California, where I'm from, of two types of power plants. So on the left, we have the Ivanpah concentrating solar plant. You can see these big squares. That's the arrays of mirrors. There's these three big squares here, and with three concentrating towers. And then on the right, I have the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, California's last remaining nuclear power plant. It's just this little sort of concrete area in the center. This is emergency cooling water up here. This is dry cask storage. So it's this little sort of shaped area right on the coast. And these maps are the same scale, so you can compare the areas. But something that's very important to note is that annually, Diablo Canyon produces about 20 times as much electricity as Ivanpah on a much, much, much smaller footprint. So that's something that raises concerns about future energy systems if we're moving more towards heavy reliance on renewable energy. But a lot of you are probably saying, what's the big deal? We, at least in the US, have a lot of land. Wind can go on agricultural land, grazing land, and it doesn't have a big impact. Solar can go on rooftops, etc. So where this comes into play really has to do with local opposition. And we're already seeing this. So more and more, we're seeing protests against renewable energy, which, people are probably pretty familiar with anti-nuclear protests, but any place we're seeing large wind and solar installations, we're starting to see more and more opposition movements. So there's a good report, if anyone's interested, from Columbia's University Sabin Center on opposition to renewable energy across the United States. And they found more than 100 ordinances that were adopted in 31 states that were actually blocking or restricting renewable energy. And also over 150 contested projects that have been canceled or stalled due to local opposition. And so, I've seen a lot of critiques of these sort of opposition movements, but the reality is that if you have a project that's very land extensive, you have a lot more people that are impacted and a lot more people that can organize in opposition to something that they see as, an industrial project on their landscape or in their neighborhood. And so, while we're all pretty familiar with anti-nuclear groups, and nuclear has, of course, faced a lot of opposition in the past with regards to siting, it does have a tiny footprint. And so the number of neighbors can be more manageable with new projects. And in particular, the economic benefits might be easier to share with the local community to sort of get buy-in from the community, which has often been where these renewables projects have come up against opposition, is that some people are getting the benefits and some people are not getting anything, but have to look at them or have their landscapes impacted. Okay, so that was a brief rundown on some of the reasons we're still interested in nuclear. But of course, there are reasons why nuclear has challenges and why maybe nuclear doesn't make sense for deep decarbonization and for our future energy system. So I do want to go through some of those. So, I'm not, naive on that. So the big one is really cost. And I think this is familiar to a lot of us. New nuclear projects tend to run over budget. I have some examples here from a new EPR in France or a new AP1000 in Georgia. They're going over budget. They're long delayed. They're taking decades to build. It doesn't look good. And, there's lots of reasons why these projects are going over budget. The designs weren't finalized, the way the contracts were structured, the way the project was managed. There are examples of places that are doing much better project management, have much better constraints on their costs, like South Korea. But for countries with liberalized power markets, with competitive power systems, nuclear just doesn't make a lot of sense. And even for existing plants, which were built, 40 plus years ago, they are struggling. In the US, that is mostly due to competition with cheap natural gas. It's just really hard to compete. Not just because natural gas is cheap, but the way the cost is structured. So for a natural gas power plant, all of the cost is in the fuel. It's all variable. Whereas for a nuclear power plant, all of the cost is in the capital. So it's a fixed cost. So even if you turn off the power plant, you're still having to pay those sort of O&M costs. You're still paying the staff. So it's harder to respond to shifts in wholesale price, which is what's necessary in more and more US states as power systems have deregulated and there's more competition. So a lot of plants are closing prematurely. A lot of plants in the US are at risk of closing because they are not cost competitive with gas for the most part. I'll talk a little bit more later about policies to kind of help those plants, but we're seeing similar things in Europe. Okay. And this has big climate implications because for a long time, nuclear was one of the largest sources of clean energy, as I mentioned before. And what this graph is showing is the percentage of the world's annual energy consumption that's coming from low carbon sources. So I've grouped them broadly into hydro, nuclear, and non-hydro renewables. That's mostly wind and solar, some geothermal in there. And you can see that nuclear grew really fast starting in the 70s, but really up through the 90s. It's a big share of global energy. And then it kind of stagnated. And we are seeing, fast growth in renewables now, but the world is still only at 17% of energy coming from low carbon sources. And for, most scientists agree to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, we need to get to 100% low carbon energy as quickly as possible, really by 2050. And so we're not on track for that. And a big part of that is because, nuclear has really stalled as a share of global energy. Hydro as well, most of our hydro was built a long time ago. There is still capacity for new hydro in a lot of parts of Southeast Asia and Africa, but it also has big constraints geographically. You can't, you have to have a big river with a large drop in elevation to have good hydro resources. And so it's not unlimited of where you can build hydro, and also has huge impacts on ecosystems and also population. So not as scalable as nuclear is per se. And this is something that my dissertation really focused on, and I'm happy to talk a lot more about it. There are pretty big geopolitical implications for this stagnation in nuclear energy, particularly in North America and Europe, who has sort of seen the interest in nuclear wane, less new builds, older plants are retiring early and not getting replaced. China and Russia, Russia in particular, are really big players in the global nuclear market, and they use nuclear exports as a point of leverage. You're seeing this play out right now with Russia in terms of they're one of the biggest fuel suppliers for nuclear. They're also definitely right now the biggest builder of nuclear power plants in other countries, particularly in emerging markets. And so a lot of countries are really dependent on Russia for their nuclear technologies. And the US and European countries, particularly France, have gotten out of this nuclear export business. We used to do a lot of nuclear exports. And it was a really great tool of sort of building genuine partnerships between countries. And now we really lost that tool. So this map on the left, which is from a great paper by Jessica Jewell from 2019, maps out all the bilateral trade agreements around nuclear technologies and science in the 2000s. And you can see the US is still a really big player, but the US agreements tend to be more on safety and security, whereas Russia, which has the second largest number of agreements, those are more on concrete technology and fuel. So they might have growing dominance, and China also has big ambitions for global nuclear exports. This map on the right is who has agreements with different countries around exporting nuclear. So blue is Russia, green is China, and teal is both. So you can see the reach of Russia's global ambitions around nuclear exports. And that's something that, pundits and security folks and international affairs people in the US have been raising flags about for at least the last 10 years, that the lack of US leadership or the decline in US leadership in the global nuclear market could have really severe implications. And we're definitely seeing that play out right now. Okay, so what can be done about that? And where are we going forward? So there is this big group of technologies called advanced nuclear, and it includes a lot of things. I'm not going to go too much into the technical details of that, but there are a lot of people working on advanced nuclear with the aim of addressing a lot of these problems and getting the US back into the global export market and just getting back as a leader in the technology overall. So there's a bunch of different nuclear technologies that we call generation 4. These are things like molten salt, metal cooled, gas cooled reactors. There's lots of different kinds. I'm sure many of you are much more familiar with them. And there's actually a lot of US companies that are working on these technologies. The think tank Third Way keeps this great interactive map that you can go and play with. You can see where these companies are in the US, what kind of technology they're working on. But they're getting a lot of private investment, a lot of venture capital is going into this, a lot of government investment in terms of advancing commercialization, helping these companies go through licensing, do their first demonstrations. So a lot's happening on advanced nuclear. It's a really exciting time. These companies are looking to build their first plants in sort of the next 5 to 10 years. A lot of them are motivated by climate change, but a lot of them also have big export ambitions. And the reason for that is that most of the market really is outside of the US and Europe. So this is a map that I helped work on. Again, it's a collaboration between the think tank Third Way and the think tank Energy for Growth Hub, which is more focused on expanding energy access in emerging markets. And what this map shows, and again, this map is interactive. I have the link here if you want to go. This map is showing the size of the bubble is growth in demand for electricity through 2030 or 2050. And the coloring is whether a country is ready for nuclear energy or not by 2030 or 2050. So dark green is ready today, light green is probably ready by 2030. And when you combine these two, you know, whether they're ready and what the growth in electricity looks like, there's a huge potential for new nuclear around the world in places that are ready for it now. So very big opportunity. And that's why, you know, a lot of these companies that are in the US are looking at overseas markets for maybe not their first build, but future builds, and are already talking to a lot of countries about potential projects. But, you know, we've seen this before. We've been talking about a nuclear renaissance since sort of the early 2000s. It hasn't really happened. There's been fits and starts. So what's needed for success? What needs to change with the industry? And what are the big obstacles? So there are some technical things, there are some policies, but there's also a lot that needs to fundamentally change about how the nuclear industry operates. And so I'm going to talk through both of those aspects. And I will say the latter is more of what Good Energy is focused on now. So the big one is making nuclear cheap. So with the big caveat that nuclear already is cheap. And what I mean by that is that it's cheap over its operating lifetime. Even these plants that are being built right now that are way over budget, if you look at the levelized cost of electricity from them, it's still competitive because they're generating a ton of electricity over 40, 60, 80 years. And so once they get built, it is actually cheap electricity, but that really high upfront cost is difficult to finance, especially in liberalized power markets, which is what we're seeing more and more of in North America and Europe, and increasingly in the rest of the world as well. So how can you bring those upfront costs down? Something that's really needed is just fixed prices and construction times. If you want to build a natural gas plant today, you can order a combined cycle turbine. It might take maybe 12 to 18 months to get delivered to you, but you're paying a fixed price for it and you know when you're getting it. That is not the case for nuclear. And so what a lot of these companies that are working on advanced nuclear are looking to do is design their nuclear reactor that can be sold more like a gas turbine or a wind turbine. So they're thinking smaller, sometimes very, very small. And also most designs are moving towards modularity. So potentially being entirely built in a factory setting or having components built in a factory setting that are easy to assemble at the final site. So more plug and play, and hopefully moving more towards known costs when you order it and fixed delivery times. And
we have a question in the chat room.
Yeah.
Could you define LR in this case?
Oh yeah, I'm gonna go into this. Yeah, so that's learning rate. And what I was going to transition into is as you're moving towards much smaller nuclear, so what we call small modular reactors, SMRs, are typically under 300 megawatts. And then you can also categorize reactors as micro reactors. That's usually under 10 megawatts electric. So that's very small. And proponents of those technologies argue they'll be much cheaper because they'll be able to be factory produced. But there are also people who argue they won't be cheaper because of economies of scale. If you're engineers, you know, the bigger something is, the cheaper it can be per unit because of economies of scale. And so there is right now a kind of theoretical debate about whether economies of scale will win out or economies of volume from factory production. So what I wanted to show in this chart, and there's been a couple of studies that looked at this, but the learning rate is how much the cost declines with successive builds. And what studies of energy generating technologies have found is that the smaller the technology, the faster it learns, which makes sense. You know, building a solar panel, you learn much faster than building, you know, a Boeing 747 aircraft. And this has been borne out with energy technologies. And so we don't know what SMRs are going to cost for the first one, for the 10th one, but there's good evidence from other energy technologies that if you're building something small, it learns faster, the cost declines faster with successive builds. And so a big chunk of my dissertation looked at potential learning rates and learning pathways for different size nuclear technologies and different economies of scale to kind of see how many you need to build. And what I found was that you don't need to build that many to bring the cost down to where it's competitive, definitely with large nuclear, but also competitive with natural gas or renewables. The other part of it is looking for niche markets for first demonstrations, where people might be willing to pay a higher price or might have conditions that make it really attractive for a first build. So for two that I'm just going to point to today. So one is using microreactors for off-grid and microgrid applications. This is chapter 2 of my dissertation, if anyone's interested. I looked at modeling microgrids with microreactors for some far northern communities in Canada and Alaska. And it can be cost competitive with their current option, which is diesel, and much more reliable. And another potential first market is repowering fossil facilities, particularly coal. The US has a lot of coal power plants that are retiring, going to be shut down in the next decade, and they could be very good host sites for small modular reactors. They have a lot of infrastructure that you could take advantage of, things like cooling water, rail lines, transmission lines that could help save on costs for the nuclear power plant. They also have a workforce that has a lot of skills that are really valuable for operating a nuclear power plant that the utility might be able to take advantage of and also keep jobs local. So this on the right is a report that Good Energy published late last year. If people are interested in looking more into that, specifically coal repowering with small modular reactors. But a big thing, you know, these new technologies are great. If nuclear is cheaper, that's also good. But there is a need to address a lot of the inequities of the past nuclear industry. So the big one is nuclear waste. And I mentioned that one first because when we talk with progressives, folks working on climate, folks working on environmental issues, nuclear waste is often the first issue and the biggest concern that people have. And, you know, a lot of you probably know this, but solving nuclear waste is not a technological issue. We don't need any sort of major innovations for it. It's really just a political stagnation issue. There hasn't been strong leadership on moving through solutions for nuclear waste. The Biden administration has said they're restarting those efforts. They've put a really good person into leadership on that issue in Department of Energy. So we'll see. Hopefully that moves forward. But we need to make some sort of progress on it to get more folks to buy into nuclear for sure, because even if it's not posing a huge risk to the public, you know, it doesn't look good that it's just sitting around at all these sites around the US where communities did not agree to have that waste there when they first sited the nuclear power plant. And so mining is another big issue. You know, right now, the US imports almost all of its nuclear fuel, a lot of it from Russia. But there are ongoing issues with abandoned mines and legacy mines, a lot of which are on tribal lands in the US in the Four Corners regions. There's really bad contamination of the drinking water in a lot of these places from uranium mining. A lot of that had to do with military, with atomic weapons, not with nuclear power generation, but it definitely gets grouped together, and people think uranium mining has a very bad history, which it does in the US. And so a scale up of nuclear is not really going to be feasible unless we can address these ongoing issues with uranium mining in the US. Now, a lot of the global uranium now comes from places like Canada and Australia, which appear to have really good practices in place around public health and environmental impacts. But that case needs to be made, and it doesn't dismiss the ongoing issues with legacy mines in the US. So no matter what happens, we need to be addressing that better. And then the last one is siting. So US nuclear has this history of what was called decide, announce, defend. So utilities would decide where they wanted to build a nuclear power plant, let people know, and then defend against legal opposition or community opposition. And it led to this very contentious legal process around siting plants and hearings. And it's just not good. And a lot of people have, pretty negative feelings around that process. Now we're starting to see this, come to head with siting of renewables projects, and it looks very similar actually. And the key for both renewables and nuclear going forward is developing just processes for siting that have early and genuine community engagement. There are communities that want these projects, but you need to find them and work with them to kind of co-develop projects that they really feel they're getting benefits from. And that is possible. We've seen that in things like siting nuclear waste, siting renewables projects. If you design it right, it's definitely possible to site and have good community buy-in, which is important for sustainability of a project. And also just something I want to mention, historically, there's been a big disparity with nuclear power in terms of who's benefited and who's borne the risk. So what we've seen, it looks different from fossil fuel power plants. So with nuclear power plants, they've tended to be built in whiter, wealthier suburban communities, whereas the fuel cycle facilities where the fuel's manufactured, where the mining's occurred, has tended to be in lower income and communities of color. So who's bearing the risks and sort of the public health impacts of the nuclear fuel cycle versus who's benefiting from the economic benefits is very different. And so thinking of ways that we can sort of expand access to who benefits and also make sure there's good social license for the harms. So some policies that can help that we're focused on, creating better models for community participation. I mentioned that, kind of build bridges between industry and government to co-create these models, really with community benefits in mind. There's just room for a lot more social science in nuclear policy. I know a lot of us here are engineers, but there's a lot more room for bringing in social science to help deploy nuclear in a more equitable way. And then, just moving forward with solution on nuclear waste, of course, is important. There has been a lot of movement on good policy for nuclear, a lot of bipartisan legislation that's gone through in the last 5 years. I'm going to skim through these, but did want to say the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, which passed Senate committee, but didn't move forward a few years ago. A lot of the good provisions in there around fuel supply and demonstration did go into the Energy Act of 2020, and other parts went into the bipartisan infrastructure deal. So we've seen a lot of those pieces move forward. There's this advanced reactor demonstration program, which is moving 2 designs forward to demonstration in sort of the next 5 years. So lots of good policies happening. And we've also seen a lot of really promising activity from the Biden-Harris administration. So notably, they have this target to have greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide by 2030. And they've been very supportive of nuclear, have stated many times that this policy is inclusive of nuclear as part of the suite of tools. There's also the Justice 40 initiative, which says that 40% of all investments towards climate change need to go to environmental justice communities. And we think that's really important in sort of addressing some of these legacy issues around nuclear, but also that nuclear investments can kind of count towards that process. So looking at things like, coal closure communities, those are environmental justice communities. They have a huge environmental and public health burden that they face from living near coal plants. And so those might be great communities for new nuclear, but also for mitigating this legacy pollution issue and fitting in under Justice 40. The bipartisan infrastructure deal included $6 billion to help existing nuclear. That's starting to get implemented. They're still needing more help on fuel supply for advanced reactors. There's been some movement. There's an RFI out right now, but could use a lot more. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going a little faster. Okay, what can you do? I know we have students and a lot of engineers in the audience. I'm going to go through this pretty fast, but did want to say, encouraging people to think more deeply about how their work in the field affects the people it serves. It's not just technology and levelized cost. You need to think about the communities that are hosting these facilities and how people are viewing the technology and their history with the technology. And when you're talking about energy, I think the first step is really needs to be listening and bringing humility around what people value and what they know about different energy technologies, and that their experience with power dynamics, not electricity power, but whether it's been how they've been treated by the government or by utilities or by corporations, could be very different than what you experienced. And so keeping that in mind when you're talking about energy, and why it's important to start by listening. Of course, sign up for Good Energy Collective to keep following what's going on with policy. And I did, because I think we have a good number of students. Just wanted to point out some opportunities if you're interested in kind of this intersection between nuclear and policy. There's some good internships and programs for students that happen every year. And there's also this Nuclear Innovation Bootcamp, which is for recent grads or kind of young professionals that want to learn about the nuclear innovation space, what it looks like to have a startup around nuclear technologies. That's a cool opportunity. Stay in touch with us. And I think I left lots of time for questions.
Oh, thank you very much. So as I normally do when I run these sessions, I solicit some questions in advance and have those. And if you have other questions, please feel free to type them into the chat window. So I will start with one that I got from students earlier today. And I'm always impressed with how our students follow the news, or sometimes I'm scared with how our students follow the news. I don't know which one is more important or more real, but the question was, earlier this year, 2 license renewals were overturned by the current administration. Why would anybody invest in nuclear energy if the next administration can just overturn approved licenses?
Yeah, so that was overturned by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So it's not necessarily administration specific, although the administration does appoint the chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And the reasons are not entirely clear, but it looks to have something to do with how the environmental impact statement was done, and they want it redone. And not expecting this to be a recurring issue that's going to, every relicense is going to face going forward. For the
Why do you
most
think
part,
that?
It seems to be something specific to the plants in Florida, with how their environmental impact statements were done. So here's why I think that. Almost every relicense application has been approved historically. The big reason for that is that utilities don't apply for renewal if they don't think they'll get it, but most plants have been licensed past 40 years. We're now starting to see the 80-year license extension, so going from 60 to 80 years. And the reason why it makes sense as an investment is that if you've already got the plant built, even if you need to do upgrades for relicensing, the electricity you're generating is still really cheap. So if it makes sense on your grid, then it's going to make economic sense for relicensing, particularly in regulated markets like most of the South and the Southeast.
Okay. I don't see anything in the chat window yet, so I'll go on with another one. So this question is, given that climate change has the potential for being very significant to humans, and the administration is willing to do things like invoke the War Powers Act for renewable materials like they did this morning or yesterday, I'm not sure which one it was. Why shouldn't nuclear plants be built under the War Powers Act?
Yeah, I think that's a tough sell when you have such a diversity of utilities in the US. I mean, the US has thousands of utilities. And even among those operating nuclear power plants, there's still quite a diversity. And so getting them to build a large infrastructure project, that's quite a tall order. We couldn't even see I don't know, supplies get built for COVID, which is on a much smaller scale. I think there's a lot sort of better policies if your goal is to accelerate deployment of clean energy, including nuclear, in terms of building out market incentives, investing in R&D testing facilities to help bring the cost down, loan guarantees for manufacturing facilities, fuel fabrication, things like that can help bring the cost down, and then have those market incentives to drive demand for clean energy. I think can help. I mean, you could say I've seen some arguments around nuclear fuel, particularly right now, where there might be some role for more top-down policy in terms of growing domestic production of fuel fabrication for nuclear power plants, because right now it's all imported. So there might be something there, or help bringing down the cost of nuclear fuel for the US. But building whole power plants does seem like a stretch for a country that doesn't have a history of really heavy-handed industrial policy. That might be more practical in a place like South Korea or Japan. But I would say not in the US, for better or for worse.
Okay. Still nothing in the chat window. Come on, live people, come up with some questions here. All right, next question I have is, I gotta go to the next page. All right, here we go. Given the extreme dangers of nuclear plants and the totally excessive costs, why is anybody wasting time on nuclear energy as a solution to climate change? It can't possibly be taken into any account fast enough to address climate change.
So I hope I addressed this in my presentation, but I didn't talk too much about safety. One of the drivers of advanced nuclear is that they almost all the designs include intrinsic safety features or passive safety features. So even though existing nuclear is already one of the safest forms of energy, it's on par with wind and solar in terms of life cycle impacts on public health and mortality. New designs, are sort of reducing the risk to trivial amounts in terms of radioactive release due to these passive safety features. I'll leave it at that. But in terms of cost, I hope I answered that as well, that nuclear actually is still very cheap over the life cycle. And when I pointed to those studies on firm power, that's another big result from those studies. If you're doing actual grid modeling, including nuclear actually reduces total systems costs and total costs for deep decarbonization. So, the levelized cost of nuclear just, per kilowatt hour might look a little higher than say wind or solar. But if you're looking at how do we actually decarbonize the whole power grid or the whole economy, when you start including things like transportation, heavy industry, including nuclear, including even new nuclear, brings those costs down significantly.
So this is kind of a lead into the next question. For things like wind and solar, amortization periods of 10 to 20 years are reasonable because it's comparable to the life cycle. But that's not a legitimate lifetime for a nuclear plant, which you mentioned could go out to 80 years. How do you address the economics of this, or why do people insist on short return periods?
That's just what investors want. That is one of the drivers of moving towards one, smaller nuclear, but also reducing the capital costs for all sizes of nuclear, is that it's easier to finance and you get your return faster. So even nuclear power plants that are planning to operate for 60 to 80 years, their loan is much shorter. It's going to be on the 20-year time scale. That's just how things are financed now. And so there's not much we can do about that. We're starting to see it's more of a problem on the investment side in terms of innovation. So for startups, a lot of venture capitalists want to see, returns in just a few years, and that does not work for a new nuclear technology, which might take a decade to actually reach first construction. So we're starting to see more investment from sort of longer term funds, things like sovereign wealth funds, which have that longer view on the future, has really helped nuclear power. And other climate tech, things like, long storage batteries, which are also on longer development timescales.
Okay, now we finally go to the chat window and responding here. So, might investors be hedging against risk of other tech breakthroughs driving lower prices?
I'm not quite sure what that question is. Whether we won't have tech breakthroughs. I guess I would take it as, if it's going to take 20 years to build a nuclear plant, isn't there a strong possibility that some other breakthrough could occur over that 20-year period? So why invest the money? Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of those challenges I mentioned around land use, also materials constraints. So a lot of renewables and also batteries, as they are right now, have critical minerals that we mine from places like DRC, Russia, that are sort of supply constraints. That's a little in the weeds. I will say, there might be a breakthrough in batteries or something that makes nuclear obsolete, but there also could be a lot of breakthroughs in nuclear that make it extremely cheap. And so you don't know. And so that's why there's investment in diversity of technologies. And one thing that I found in my modeling, and other people have found this with grid scale modeling, if you get really cheap batteries, it helps renewables, sure, it also really helps nuclear because they can do this cost arbitrage. So if you have nuclear paired with grid scale batteries, if the wholesale price is really high, nuclear can just sell electricity. If the price is really low, they can charge their batteries up and sell it later. And there are nuclear power plants that are designing their plant to operate in this capacity right now with sort of molten salt storage. So they work better in competitive markets because they have that ability to sort of ramp up and down depending on the price.
Okay. How do you propose dealing with siting inequities with regard to continued use of existing plants and with regard to new plants and waste sites as well?
Yeah, so I think in terms of siting inequities, I think more resources from the government in terms of helping communities do feasibility studies, helping coal communities do feasibility studies of how they're going to replace that generation, replace those jobs from the coal power plant. There already are funds to do some of this work, but we need a lot more if we're looking at a big scale up of clean energy. And also resources for nuclear vendors to help them look more broadly at potential host communities, not just sort of like, I had a friend that I was golfing with and he said I should build over here where he has a power plant, that's how it was done in the past. So looking more at who needs electricity, who has a good workforce, who has industrial sites that are maybe closing, that has excess capacity, things like that. So better tools for helping site in places that might be more amenable.
Okay. This is me editorializing for a second, so I'll put that on the record. Our social science department recently submitted a proposal to the Department of Energy, and it was reviewed for both technical and program relevance. And on the technical side, the technical reviewers said that it introduced new methodologies into siting research, but it was killed on the program side because the program side said this is of no interest to nuclear builds. If siting is of no interest to either waste or new nuclear builds, why do we care?
Well, I think it is, and this is a problem from Department of Energy in the past is very siloed thinking, and so this call for more injection of social science needs to happen at sort of the appropriations level in terms of how funding is directed within Department of Energy, but also in terms of the people that are at Department of Energy thinking about how do we incorporate more social science into these what have historically been very technical decisions of like the earthquake risk, the flood risk, you can't put a plant there, rather than does the community want it, and what's the history of nuclear in this location. So that's a big challenge and has not been solved. So we're working on it. How does one
go about breaking down these programmatic barriers?
New people.
Idea.
So there has been a big focus from the Biden administration of getting more kind of focus on environmental justice within Department of Energy, and a lot of when we talk about environmental justice is process. How are things cited? That is a big question around environmental justice. It's not just whether something is clean or dirty, it's what is the process for citing something. And so I'm hopeful that they've brought in a lot more people to focus on justice within Department of Energy. That will help kind of expand the types of questions, the types of research that they're funding. But it's just getting started.
Okay. What affects the innovation in the nuclear energy sector? What determines the variation of commercialization of nuclear energy at the state and local level?
So innovation infrastructure is a big one. This is more country to country, how much you're investing in science and technology education, but also research capabilities. A big thing that's going on right now is the US does not currently have fast spectrum capabilities to test fuels and components. right now, most advanced reactor companies were planning to go to Russia for those capabilities. That's kind of in limbo. There's this versatile test reactor, which was supposed to be built at Idaho National Labs. It keeps having its funding kind of cut or not getting any funding. So it looks a little stalled. Things like that are really needed. And this is where you're seeing huge investments in China and Russia into their innovation ecosystem. They don't have the same sort of competitive market ecosystem, which is where the US thrives. They don't have that venture capital market investing in startups. But you need both the kind of venture capital innovation system, and also you need the actual hard infrastructure for innovation.
What is the distinction that you identified between the US and Korea and Japan in terms of nuclear energy policy?
Yeah, so that's not specific to nuclear. What I was talking about is industrial policy. So it's not just, Japan and Korea have really strong industrial policies in terms of encouraging diversification of the supply chain, manufacturing capabilities, onshoring, supporting, facilities for manufacturing. You see this a lot in nuclear in South Korea and Japan, but France also had significant top-down industrial policy in terms of not just nuclear, but also aircraft manufacturing, things like that. The US has really lacked an industrial policy. That's just how the economy is structured, how the government's structured, really more of a hands-off approach on industrial policy. That's not to say the US doesn't do a lot on innovation and investing a lot in R&D, which is huge, but they don't have as much. That's starting to change because of climate change. The investment of government policy that is taking things from, lab scale to prototype to commercialization, as you might see in other countries.
Okay. We have another question. What about fusion?
Yep. There are companies working on fusion. There's private companies getting big venture capital to commercialize fusion designs. There's actually something going on in DC this last week and this week, some White House events around fusion, and so lots happening. We'll see. I don't think it's as far along as the fission designs in terms of first demonstration commercialization, but I wouldn't rule it out.
And then what are some of the top concerns that communities have raised across the US?
Ooh, depends on the community. Very different concerns. I think the big one, so I'll just say California for existing nuclear, is water consumption and temperature pollution. So pulling in cold ocean water and expelling warmer water. New designs can address that, and there's ways you can address it even for existing plants. One of the big ones for new projects is really just who's benefiting. So is the workforce going to be local? Are they going to pull from the local population for workers? Or are they going to bring in outside workers? How much tax revenue are they getting? Is there a risk to the water supply if something goes wrong? Or a risk to, food production or other industries, tourism. So those are sorts of the questions that communities raise. But for a lot of these communities, haven't heard that much about nuclear. It's been interesting to watch what's going on in Wyoming, where you have TerraPower citing a new advanced nuclear plant at a old coal power plant site and seeing community response and community engagement around that. We're learning a lot because we haven't built a new nuclear power plant at a site that didn't already have a nuclear power plant in several decades. So,
okay. And then let me follow up with the last question. That's one of my favorites. Who are the members of Congress to watch in the area of nuclear energy?
Oh, I should know this. I wish my colleague Jackie Toth was on. She does more of our Hill outreach. There's a good cohort of bipartisan legislators in Congress and especially in the Senate that work on nuclear. Email me or message me and I'll give you a better list. I do not keep this information in my head, but I keep it
No
in
problem.
documents. So
I will I will send you an email to get that list from you and pass it along to our students. Well, with that, I'd like to thank our speaker. And if everybody remembers, we thank our speaker by typing applause into the chat window. Thank you for coming today. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you to everybody in the audience for their great questions.
Yeah, and happy to follow up if people want to shoot questions on Twitter or send them my way. However, happy to keep the conversation going.
Okay, and I'll definitely send you something about the congressional people in nuclear energy.
Okay, great. We'll answer it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for coming today.
Bye.